It's a pleasure to welcome you to the program. My name is Felicity Ezewike, your host. West Africa has been identified as a climate change hotspot. Climate change contributed to mounting food insecurity, insufficiency, and displacement in Africa in 2020. A UN-backed report from the World Meteorological Organization and partners released in October 2021 confirms this. Now, the State of the Climate in Africa 2020 report highlighted the continent's disproportionate vulnerability. Disproportionate because despite having contributed the least to global warming and having the lowest emissions, Africa faces exponential collateral damage from climate change that threatens to undo its modest development gains. Now, African leaders are aware of the dangers, and beyond individual efforts, they acknowledge the potency of working together to combat climate change. Hence, Regional Bloc ECOWAS worked throughout 2021 to develop a regional climate strategy in West Africa. And 3 days ago in Ghana, the 15 ministers of environment of ECOWAS member states validated it. The strategy aims to strengthen the region's resilience to the impacts of climate change, in particular through support for the implementation of the commitments made by its member states under the Paris Agreement of 2015. Why is this strategy so important? Will this collective effort produce better results? To share his perspective and expatiate on the climate change conversation as it affects West Africa, as well as the relevance of this regional climate strategy, is Dr. Richard Munang. He is the UN Environment Climate Change Coordinator for Africa and Acting Deputy Director of UNEP Africa Office. He is leading a continent-wide strategic and innovative approach to climate action implementation for UNEP. Dr. Munang has participated in a wide variety of research projects and has published over 500 articles in both international peer-reviewed journals and magazines. He is the author of Making Africa Work Through the Power of Innovative Volunteerism, a book outlining practical policies that countries in Africa should take to accelerate climate action. He joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much for speaking with us here.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Some people say the effects of climate change is being exaggerated. Is it?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I think that's a false narrative from people who say so, because let me just put this, use a simple analogy here. If you are asked to give your biodata and you provide your birth certificates and your certificates and your degrees and everything, and the person you give those information to turns around and tells you that this is not correct, I think that is a false narrative from the perspective that what you've given that is authentic, then the person you've given it to is rejecting. That's the same thing with the changing climate today. The science is unequivocal that the world is warming, and we are currently at 1.1 degree as the global community. When you take that down to the continent of Africa, Africa is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. And therefore, anyone who is oblivious to the realities of droughts that we're seeing currently affecting the Horn of Africa today, with all of 15 million people affected, to the Sahel in West Africa, to the floods that we just recently saw in Southern African region. I mean, the list goes on, and even the floods in Lagos that we saw the past years. These are testaments and actually scientific evidence showcase that climate change is turbocharging and supercharging these events. So for those who say so, they're living in oblivious space.
For those that are still doubting, could you maybe explain in real terms how this climate change is disrupting not just our lives, like you highlighted, floods and all of that, but the economy?
The reality is that if you look at the entire African continent today, Africa is an agrarian continent with over 65% of the workforce of the continent in the agro sector and 98% of this agricultural sector, whether we're talking East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, Southern African region, and even North Africa. 98% of the agricultural sector is dependent on rainfed. And because of the changing climate that is disrupting weather patterns, the erratic nature of the rainfall is actually affecting farmers not to have bumper harvests. What does this mean? It actually means agricultural sector that contribute 32% to the GDP of the entire continent is affected. What does this mean? It means that mothers in communities and children and fathers and parents cannot be able to put food on the table and more money in more pocket because they don't have all these opportunities. Then the economy then shrinks. And more importantly, the reality of the continent, because of the failure in crop as a result of the changing climate, as a result of the drought, which we're already seeing, countries now will increase importation of food. What does this mean? It depreciates foreign reserves and only further escalate the economic challenges that the continent is already facing today. And let me just bring in this perspective, which is what we're currently facing as a global community and even the world and Africa. We're facing on top of the changing climate that Africa is already suffering, and we are seeing the effects. We're suffering food crisis because of inflation. We're suffering fuel crisis. And this is further going to depreciate the foreign reserves of governments and only worsen the economic crisis. And climate change on top of this makes it worse. That then means the best economic arsenal is climate adaptation and mitigation.
Let's talk about something that, I mean, all through the course of my prepping for this conversation kept coming up. And the talk about the disproportionate vulnerability of West Africa to the climate change, particularly because we don't seem to cause a lot of it. We don't contribute a lot to the damages that's happening to the climate, but we seem to be suffering the impact more. Can you speak to the validity of that continuous comment that West Africa is most vulnerable in spite of not contributing to the emissions?
Yes, let me, before I get down to West Africa, Africa as an entire continent have only contributed between 2 to 3% of the entire greenhouse gas emissions. That means Africa as a whole is a negligible emitter. When it comes to West Africa, of course, what you've said is very true. It's contributed very least to the changing climate, to the greenhouse gas emissions. And as I said earlier, the entire continent, and West Africa inclusive, is an agrarian continent. Most of the households depend on the agricultural sector, and because of the changing climate that is exacerbating and increasing the droughts, these are actually causing crop failure. And when this causes crop failure that are the source of livelihood for over 65% of people in West Africa and the continent, what do you expect? They become poorer. They then search for other alternatives to survive. They look for these alternatives, not even in places where they are best. That means they move away from their home. They move away even from their countries to others. And these then only worsen the situation. So the point at the moment is how can we be able, despite the fact that climate change is happening now and it is with us and is affecting people in West Africa, how can we leverage this challenge and turn it into an opportunity? And I think that is really where the focus should be, because in as much as the changing climate is plunging millions in West Africa into suffering, there are also windows of opportunity that we can also focus on to seize and better the livelihoods of humanity.
We definitely explore that, because that's the core reason for this conversation, looking for solutions to our unique African problems. I wouldn't want to go on and ask that you explain how this is exacerbating insecurity, but I will talk about the displacement, internally displaced. The study is suggesting, not the climate report, is suggesting that by 2050, we'll begin to see it. But there are those who are arguing that climate change, aside insecurity and terrorism and insurgency, is making people move from their home. How true is this? And are there verifiable data that clearly shows this?
When you look at the data that we have and has been produced by credible international organizations, including the UN and the World Bank. The World Bank report shows that 86.4 million Africans by 2050, that's about the next 28 years, will be displaced internally. But I like to use facts using also the present. If we are looking at the present, the current data we have using the drought that is plunging over 15 million people in the Horn of Africa shows that 15 million people have, as we speak today, have left where they are. They've left their homes to search for other alternatives because of the current drought that is affecting them. This is applicable to West Africa and especially the Sahel. A lot of people have left their home. So what the data is showing is Currently, we are having people who are displaced. Then it will only get worse, because if emissions are not cut, what the data is showing and what the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was released in April this year shows, and it was released, the third report was released in April this year, and the first one was released in August last year, shows that we are almost heading towards 1.5 degrees. What does this mean? It will mean that Africa will be heading towards almost 3 degrees. This will mean people will have to look for opportunities and alternatives. I will go back to the point that I keep mentioning. An agrarian continent in crop failure, people have to look for alternatives to put food on the table and more money in more pockets. And so that is definitely going to happen, not by 2020. It is happening now with the current drought in East Africa, if I was to use that as a reference. So we are going to see people leaving their countries, leaving their villages to look for alternatives to survive.
It's important that we clearly state what the problem is, because some people, like I mentioned in my introduction, including very educated Africans, feel that the effect of climate change is overblown, so that people can get funding. So we needed to establish that it is a menace in Africa. Let's come to the focus of this conversation. And just 3 days ago, the ministers of the 15 member states validated the State of Climate in Africa 2020 agreement. I wanted to find out from you what you think of that ECOWAS regional climate strategy. What do you think about it, really? Is it the catalyst for making action more viable, as is being promoted?
It is. Let me first of all start by applauding ECOWAS as a community for coming up with this climate change strategy. But more broadly, let me applaud the entire continent, because Africa is the leader when it comes to climate change policy. We must appreciate progress if we really want to make progress. Out of the 54 African countries, as we speak today, 52 African countries submitted what is called the nationally determined contributions, which are plans for countries to be able to build resilience and ensure that at least they have robust economies, they have livelihoods that are resilient to the changing climate. African countries, 52 of them, submitted the nationally determined contribution. As we're speaking today, 43 of them have submitted a revised version, and this is the highest of any region across the entire world. That's impressive. And now when it comes to regional economic communities, we have now ECOWAS, which is submitting their climate change strategy. And on top of that, when you look at the 15 countries of ECOWAS, 14 of them have submitted the nationally determined contribution. So when it comes to policy, this is really an area in which Africa takes leadership, and ECOWAS and West Africa takes leadership. So we must applaud them. So with the strategy that has been put in place, that is a step in the right direction, because then that means that the coordination in terms of what each country does in West Africa can actually generate information that can also help other countries leverage on what is happening and synergistically drive climate action, because collective action always outweighs individual action. And so having these strategies ensures coordination, ensures lesson sharing, and also ensures that action can actually be taken with speed, fitting into the national circumstances of countries. So I would say this is a brilliant move by ECOWAS.
Yeah, having said that, do you agree that if we must make real progress with the fight against climate change, that this is the document that will propel us towards that end? Do you agree? Some think it's overly ambitious. Is it?
I think that I would like to debunk a myth that have been out there for quite a very long time. Not only in the continent, but even across the world, but I'll put it within the context of the African continent, which is that strategies by themselves or policies by themselves will implement themselves. That doesn't work that way anywhere on earth. It is people who implement policies, it's people who implement strategies. Why am I saying this? The strategies and policies that have been put in place need each and every citizen, state and non-state actors, to now engage, because the conducive environment and the legal framework and structure has been put in place. And when you look at this strategy, which I read through the synopsis, it identifies targeted areas in which ECOWAS should focus on: agriculture, clean energy, fisheries, coastal areas that needs to actually be protected. When you take agriculture, this is actually one of the biggest opportunity that the entire African continent have got. It is agribusiness in agriculture when value is added is worth $1 trillion US in less than 8 years from today. What does this mean? It means making agriculture resilient, moving from production alone, leveraging climate smart agricultural techniques, which many countries are already having in their strategy and their NDC, adding value to what is produced. Because we're speaking today, Africa is losing up to $48 billion US, and so is West Africa. If value using clean energy solutions that are captured in this strategy, clean energy to add value, then finished products will be in place, and then importation of food will then be reduced, and then more money and less depreciation of foreign reserves will happen. So this strategy is actually an economic strategy. If it is leveraged through the climate lens to then ensure that the agricultural system, entire food systems are made climate resilient by adding value using clean energy. Then also leveraging this to ensure that, because as we're speaking today, there are 293 people in West Africa, in the ECOWAS region, that die as a result of indoor pollution each and every year. If you take Nigeria, where we're speaking today, Nigeria lost in 2021 97,000 acres of forest as a result of charcoal harvesting. Moving towards clean energy means that cleaner solutions for cooking will then reduce indoor pollution that is killing up to 293,000 people each and every year. And turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes will replace charcoal, which is 3 times more efficient and will put more money in more pockets. But the point why I'm bringing up these practical solutions is that leveraging this strategy through the economic lens could actually be an economic booster for the region and will help put more food on the table and money in more pockets.
Indeed. I mean, we will explore extensively, as much as the time will permit us, or other strategies for implementation. Because like you said, one thing is to have a fine draft of a plan, but the next thing is the implementation. I think this is a good spot for us to go on a quick break. When we come back, we'll be exploring the goals of the strategy and how we can implement them in real terms. Stay with us. Glad you're still with us. We still have Dr. Richard Munang speaking with us all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. Before we went on that break, you were explaining some of the areas that the report, the strategy covers. And one thing that I got is implementation is most important. In each state already has plans, right? And the idea is that this strategy will facilitate and help these state players, implement their policies. How will this strategy really propel that commitment? Because we already have state policies, state movement, and, but it doesn't seem to be really, affecting and pushing the action plan forward. How would this strategy do that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think that we need to look into in detail, as I said earlier, policies or strategies do not implement themselves, and you've quite emphasized on that, is that there are no absence of ideas and absence of innovations on the ground. I mean, people have been implementing climate action solutions. Our mothers in villages have devised means to cope with drought. They've devised indigenous approaches that people are using indigenous knowledge to cope and survive. And there are young people across ECOWAS and Africa who are devising solutions to address some of these challenges. Why am I bringing this up? There are no absence of innovations. What we actually need urgently to turn these strategies into a live reality of actions is incentives. And incentives here are not just money. Incentives also means engaging people and appreciating what the young people are already doing across the continent, and building on what is already working, not reinventing the wheel. And I decided to bring this up because there is one big challenge that is never really discussed across the entire African continent when it comes to climate change project implementation, which is duplication of efforts. And so the strategy highlighting excellent areas of agriculture, of fisheries, of clean energy, of resilient infrastructure needs to then become more a framework that leverages on what is already working and fill gaps where they do exist. And that becomes an incentive in that those who are already doing something will even become excited to do more. And the gaps in the things they are already doing, implementing action, whether in the agro sector, whether in water sector, whether in the fishery sectors or coastal and infrastructure, will then not be starting from scratch, but filling gap and advancing progress. That is important. And we also need financial incentives. And financial incentives must be in such a way that structures that are accessible to the informal sector, because the informal sector constitutes over 80% even of the population of ECOWAS and that of the entire African continent. And these are our mothers in communities and in villages. So we must be able to target them with incentives, the financial incentives, leveraging structures like cooperatives that they are used to, so that at least they can be able to tap the necessary finance in which they can then be able to access the tools that can help them build climate resilience. The other aspect which is really, really important is institutions. And I bring institutions here. Of course, institutions do exist, and we have ministries, and we have departments, and we have financial institutions, we have academic institutions. But they need to now start leveraging climate action and mainstreaming this into all their operations, because most of the time when we have institutions, it's not just the institutions like ministries or school, but people are also institutions in that they need to embrace climate action as a responsibility for them to do it in whatever profession in which they are in. Whether it's a journalist like yourself, we're discussing climate change today, or a climate expert like me, or people who are not even in climate space can then be able to embrace these. And the last one is implementation, which is now what we're talking about. Implementation needs to embrace all these other 4 I's, these ideas, these innovations, incentives, and engage the young people who actually are 60% of the entire African population, and they are actually the climate action army, that if we don't tap them, we cannot be able, because you can only go to war with the army you have. And if you do not tap young people and incentivize them with the requisite enablers, like tax incentives for those who have already developed or are developing enterprises in climate areas, so that at least they can bring this to scale and make impact in communities, we might never be able to really build climate resilience without leveraging on these opportunities.
True. I mean, I just had to let you go on because what you were saying was so important. But there is something you said I'd like you to expand a little on, because I see that might be an issue, blending regional and local efforts at combating climate change. You talked about the duplication of efforts. Can you expand on that issue, please?
Yeah, duplication of efforts is the biggest risk of implementing climate action solutions. Not only climate action, even development actions across the entire African continent. And how does this happen? It happens in that most of the time context, because context, if you miss context, then whatever thing we do, we might never really succeed. And what do I mean by context? Every community have people who do something. And sometimes we need their buy-in to build on what they are doing. We don't need to reinvent the wheel or introduce solutions sometimes as if they are new. I believe that if we introduce solutions in a way that communities can own, in a way that communities can actually say, this is what we are doing, this is the gap we are filling, we need you to fill, then that way they will own the process, and at the same time, the targeted intervention will have more meaningful impact rather than a supply-driven approach that comes with something that is already existing, and then you end up not having ownership, and then you end up just duplicating what exists. And most of the time, this happens because we do not leverage on what is already ongoing or engage communities upfront to understand their challenges and understand their problems, but sometimes want to showcase that something is happening, which is well-intended and with good intention, but somehow misses the way things are supposed to be done. I think the last aspect we really need here is that sustainability is not just about continuous finance. It's about ownership by the communities. And any action must be demand-driven and not supply-driven. We must listen to the communities, we must listen to people, and any action that needs to be taken must be coming to add value to them and must add value through the economic sense. And I say economic sense because social-driven action can be helpful, but they are not sustainable. But when there is the economic dimension, if a mother in a village, let me give a practical example. If a mother in a community in West Africa or any part of Africa is producing her maize and she gets bumper harvest, if she loses this maize because she cannot dry that maize, then she will be disincentivized of even producing, even if she was using nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation that work with nature, not against nature. But if she is provided a simple solar dryer that can add value to her tomatoes, to her vegetables, to her maize to dry, then she will then be able to fetch a market, even if she doesn't have a market in a week or two or even a month. In the next 6 months, she can fetch a market because she'll have dried vegetables. And that way, she will be more excited because she'll put money in her pocket and she can then now grow more of that maize or vegetables and sell it. But if we go only providing seeds, without understanding the challenge of this farmer or this mother, that her challenge was not about growing more, but it was about reducing the post-harvest losses that she is suffering, then we will be having good intentions, but end up duplicating effort that costs money and waste time.
Yes, still on that duplication, while you were explaining it, I recall that there was a question, I can't the entire detail, but it has to do with a debt of data when it comes to the impact of climate change across Africa, not just West Africa. I think there was a report that said they could not come up with a summation because there is inadequate data on climate change. So what impact will this duplication of effort have with, getting usable data on climate change across Africa? And who do you think should be at the forefront of making sure that we have proper data on climate change? Because without data, we might just be moving around in the dark.
Yes, I always like to say that Africa is not a statistical data point. The issues on climate change in West Africa are different from the issues of climate change in East Africa or Southern Africa. But there is a commonality, which is that in as much as there is inadequate data, there is what is called anecdotal evidence. Our mothers in community have experienced this firsthand. They used to see droughts 30 years before they see another one. Today, most of them see droughts every other year. If I take the Horn of Africa and even the Sahel, droughts are now reoccurring nearly every year. I mean, anecdotal evidence, if there is actually no scientific data, that anecdotal evidence can also help provide an opportunity for more research. So we need more support for scientific research to document indigenous knowledge, also anecdotal information, but at the same time, we also need to build on what we have and act without necessarily having to sit and complain, because actually we will never ever have everything to act. There is data. Is it enough? No. But can there also be data on the actions that are making transformational development? Because what I also see is that there's little appetite to collect also information on the actions that are changing lives. Let me take the Zai that is used in West Africa, which is a simple demonstration of how a little hole dug on a farm, an organic manure put in it, when rain falls and erratic rains happening, captures the water. And these have resulted in 500% yields in Burkina Faso and in some parts of the Sahel. But I hardly hear these aspects discussed as the norm and not the exception. So the appetite to also grab what is working, leveraging indigenous nature-based solutions, seems not really to be there. So what I would suggest is that we must build on what we have as we continue to search and gather more data to then inform these strategies, as well as recalibrate a policy. And that responsibility rests on each and everyone's shoulder. It's not only on researchers, it's on everybody to start to find that information. And just like the questions you are asking today, and also asking questions about data, everybody should then be able in his or her capacity.
Well, I think what I'll take is we will try before this conversation is over to get you to highlight the ones you can remember that's being done across Africa, which is your domain, so to speak. Let's talk money. 2030 seems to be a target for implementation of the plan that's been put together by ECOWAS, and they've agreed to spend some $294 million now, billion, I beg your pardon, $1 billion in the next 10 years to address climate change problems such as land erosion. I'm curious, how do you think this funding will come about, and How do we measure implementation? You said when we started that it's not a debt of plans, it's not a debt of strategy, it is implementation. This funding in the first instance, how will it come? And how do we measure that this money is actually being used appropriately?
Yeah, very interesting question, and thank you for that. When it comes to finance, I know that it's always a very it's an area of interest for everyone, especially in the continent, because of the vulnerabilities that we are seeing and the challenges. I will have to say three things here. The first is we must acknowledge that Africa is spending 2% of their GDP in funding climate adaptation. Yes, they are using that from their national budgets, and this is hardly always acknowledged. The bigger question should then be, I think it's not about the 297 or 94 billion alone that should be of interest. It should be, how can the little resources that the continent can raise, or ECOWAS can raise, or countries in West Africa can raise, be used to incentivize the private sector to then be able to bring in more private finance? And I say this because Africa as a continent, currently with a changing climate, needs between 7 to 15 billion to fund adaptation that is already to build the climate resilience and avert the shocks that are already happening through droughts, floods, etc. And by 2050, Africa will need 50 billion US dollars, and the number will only increase. It therefore means that the little resources from the 2% of the GDP of the entire continent that is currently being spent on climate action, mostly adaptation, to the amounts that are currently being raised, there needs to be a very strategic way to leverage those funds so that at least they can incentivize action for young people to be able to access that finance and inject it into enterprises that can actually be able to build this climate resilience. Let me give you a very practical example here, and I mentioned this upfront. Every community in Africa, to the best of my knowledge, have social structures called communal cooperatives. They have different names. In East Africa, I call them chamas. In Cameroon, where I come from, we call them jangis. And I believe in Nigeria and in Ghana, there are different names, but it means the same thing. Where people come together, those structures do exist. Can this be leveraged for some of this money to be channeled through so that at least it can have direct impact to our mothers in communities so they can access this money and apply, especially those who apply climate solutions, whether it is agroforestry or it is organic manure, or access inputs like solar dryers, that if they need this can be done. The second is, and I think Nigeria did have a very excellent example. They did do this, a risk sharing facility. I think this was for agriculture that they developed, and Ghana has done this. It was called NESA, Nigeria Insurance Risk Sharing Agricultural Lending Facility. Can such examples be cascaded to communities so that this microfinance organization can then be able to access money through facilities, then to use that to lend to communities to be able to leverage this money? Why I keep saying this is that when we do not use local structures, then the accessibility of finance to address simple issues in community, to build resilience of community, to help mothers access tools or access inputs that can ensure that at least they can have bumper harvest, apply organic manure, access simple solar dryers, or access clean cook stoves or clean cooking solutions like briquettes, then we might not be able to actually engage the population that matters. It therefore means that resources cannot only be discussed from money perspective. They need to also be discussed from how can they be channeled. And the best way to channel this is to use structures that are accessible to the communities, to the informal sector, so that at least they can then be able to access it themselves as we provide technical backup and guidance, but they should have access to money in their communities.
All right, Doctor. I mean, you've spoken quite very well, really. And sometimes I'm wondering if I ask the question, you've even answered it. Let's go on a short break. When we come back, he's talked a bit about implementation. What we're going to do when we come back is explore how we can actually make this work. What do we have on the ground? Are we utilizing it well? Solutions to climate change continues. Stay with us. Good to know you're still with us. Back to Dr. Munang now. We'll talk about lifestyle because I know that's a very important part of the action plan. But for now, let's talk about renewable energy. Conversation, you mentioned it as one of the solutions. We need to move towards, other sources of energy other than fossil fuel. Considering the way Africa is set up, some parts have, some parts don't have. How do you think, or let me rephrase that, will this strategic plan, this strategy that ECOWAS has come up with, from what you saw of it, does it address the question of renewable energy? And are you satisfied with the submission that is there?
Yes, the beauty is that this strategy is dovetailing into what countries in the ECOWAS region have already put in their plans to be able to lower emissions and move towards a low carbon development pathway. So it's re-emphasizing that on each of the plans that the 15 countries have submitted have clean energy and sustainable agriculture. And so the strategy is actually an additional impetus to help fast track the implementation of those aspects. And let's put it in perspective. From the African perspective, we have over 620 million Africans who are energy impoverished. When it comes to the Sahel, we have over 150 million people who are energy impoverished. And when you look at the Sahel, the sun that shines in the Sahel can actually light the entire Europe. And so that is an asset. And that energy captured will not only be able to provide energy lighting in homes in the Sahel region or in the ECOWAS region, but it can actually be exported. And that would be an additional opportunity to generate revenue for the region and for the countries in the region. But more importantly, let's move away from energy just from lighting and electrification. Let's look at it from value addition. As we're speaking today, actually, Africa is losing food worth $48 billion US. Why? Because of lack of value addition. And when you look at those in local communities, they do not have access to electricity. And the easiest electricity that can reach them is off-grid. And off-grid, like solar electricity, solar energy is the best, easiest way to then be able to reach these people. But when it reaches them from the perspective of them helping mothers to dry their food, to add value using this solar energy, then people will be putting more money in their pockets. And that will ensure that at least you can lift people up from the bottom of the pyramid, lift people from poverty, and at the same time, help ensure that some of these people now will start creating their own businesses and they can start paying taxes back to the economies of the country. Paying taxes, and that will jumpstart the economy of the country. So the point I'm trying to make is that energy is actually the lifeline of any transformational progress and the lifeline of economic progression. And so leveraging it, as have been put in this strategy and also put in countries' climate change policies and nationally determined contributions, if this is leveraged and implemented forcefully, especially in the ECOWAS region that have 365 days of sunshine, the lives of people will be changed, and then post-harvest losses will be reduced, and importation of food will also reduce because value will be added to what is being produced.
Let me act like a child and put pinkies crossed that these things will begin to manifest in real time for us across Africa. Let's talk lifestyle, because it is one of the major suggestions in that strategy, suggesting that people change their lifestyle so that we can get to the goal of reducing emissions. What in specific terms, like what are specific changes should we be looking at to change in our lifestyle if we're to get to our goal? I have another flip side to the question, but let's take this part first.
Yes, if you look currently, as I said earlier, the current lifestyle across the continent, especially in the ECOWAS region, where our mothers do not have alternative, they use charcoal. They don't have an alternative. They use charcoal, and this indoor charcoal is killing over 243 to 293 citizens. They've committed no crime. The only issue is that they don't have an alternative, and so they depend on charcoal. Moving away from depending on charcoal to clean energy solutions is a change of lifestyle. And this can happen by the governments in the region incentivizing alternatives like turning simple agricultural waste to fuel briquettes. Young people are doing this across ECOWAS, in Nigeria, in Ghana. We are working with them, and in East Africa here across the continent. So when lifestyle, from depending on high emitting, polluting energy sources to now clean cooking solutions, that puts more money in more pockets and reduces indoor pollution that then saves lives, because as we speak, 700,000 Africans die each and every year because of indoor pollution. That is one. The second aspect of a lifestyle is the food we eat. First of all, chemicalized food that is being grown is not good for the environment. It is expensive because it's depending on imported fertilizers that destroy the environment, and actually at the same time also destroy the soil, meaning that bumper harvest will not even happen for a long time. But moving towards organic agriculture, organic inputs, will then help ensure we have bumper harvest, but at the same time create opportunities and jobs whereby young people can start creating enterprises in producing organic manure, in producing organic fertilizers, and so on and so forth. And the food we eat that is produced organically is more healthier and scientifically proven so. And then that process reduces emissions into the atmosphere. So we need a kind of a system thinking which benefits our health, which jumpstart economies, and that needs a lifestyle change that will have to happen anyway because of the policy changes that are happening in countries. And these strategies actually come to reinforce that.
Fashion is a big deal. I know it's like a small for other people, but I read somewhere, I don't know how true it is, that if we reduce the amount of times the number of clothes we have, the amount of time, the kind of fabric that we use to make what we wear, that is also one way. And I know fashion is like the thing now. So is that even a conversation that we should be considering when it comes to managing climate change?
Absolutely. To produce one pair of jeans, you need 7,000 liters of water. 7,000 liters of water. And so where is that water coming from? That water is coming as a result. That's an ecosystem service from a forest. The forest produces that. So when you draw that heavy water and at the same time cut down the forest, then you are actually not only resulting in degrading the environment, but at the same time also resulting in emissions, because deforestation results to carbon emissions that are released into the atmosphere. But if we look at it from this perspective, we can actually move to sustainable fashion, whereby waste, and there are excellent youth in Nigeria and ECOWAS region that are actually using waste to make plastic bags, to make plastic shoes, to make laptop bags, and that they're also using it to make suits and jackets. So moving from the traditional style of clothing to clothing that is actually being recycled reduces emissions, reduces the pressure on the environment in terms of the water that is drawn out, and at the same time also ensures that at least opportunities are created. That kind of thinking is called a circular economy, where what is produced is not just discarded. If a dress is produced that is from recycling, it is saving the environment, it is reducing emissions, and at the same time, it is also helping create opportunities and then ends back in the economy without necessarily having to have emissions produced into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So that is a very, very important aspect, and thank you for bringing that up. It means we need to move towards a circular economy mindset, and that means how we produce, how we reduce, and how we consume need to become part and parcel of each and every one of us, not only that of governments, but that of citizens.
Okay, so I was distracted by that question. I had to ask it. Let's flip back to the economic part of the we're out of time, so I'll need you to be a little brief. I still have like 2 questions, if not 3. The economic part of it, you talked about the housewife transitioning from coal to other forms of cooking. You also talked about the kind of food that we eat. Poverty is endemic in Africa. How will that impact on people's decision? Because if you're saying, I want to change my lifestyle, and you don't have the funding to do that, how would you go about it? Is it possible that government can subsidize this? What would be your suggestion to addressing that part of the conversation?
I will go back to what I said earlier. We do not do development for people. People do development for themselves. The role of government is to facilitate the process. What does this mean in reality? Our mothers in villages, I mean, we grew up in the village, so I always use the example of the village. I mean, they're not just sitting there waiting for things to be done for them. They're doing something. And what they need are basic necessity: water, clean drinking water, maybe a route to the market so that at least they can sell their cocoyams or maize or beans. They need to add value. And what I said, and I will still repeat it now, on how people can be easily lifted out of poverty using climate action solutions or climate thinking processes, is to be able to identify the gaps. And most of these gaps are known. We know that 65% of the continent and even of West Africa are engaged in the agricultural sector. They lose post-harvest losses costing the continent $48 billion US. It means value needs to be added.
I'm being told we need to wrap up, and I have two questions, so I'm just going to lump them together. First is quickly, maybe in a minute or two, highlight. You mentioned us celebrating what we've been able to do. I beg your pardon, towards attaining climate change actions, right? Changes. What are some of them across Africa? If you can spend a minute responding to that, and then spend a minute talking about the key moves you expect to see from West African countries, Africa generally, in the next decade that will prove that our goal of attaining to attain these SDG goals when it regards climate, we're not just dreaming about it, but it's going to happen. What are the key things you expect to see that will encourage you to believe that?
Yeah, from the first question, I mean, there are climate action solutions that we see dotted across the continent, especially young people. We're seeing them turning agricultural waste to fuel briquettes. We're seeing young people developing simple climate action solar dryers that are helping mothers in villages dry their vegetables. Those are climate action solutions. But this is what I would say. The solutions of climate change cannot always be seen through the lens of big infrastructure, though we need that. But we need to build on these little solutions or small scale action that young people are taking forward. And for the easiest way to do that is to integrate climate action solution into the mainstream of national development, which is the curriculum, so that everybody take a course on climate entrepreneurship. Then the actions that are happening from clean energy solutions to agricultural solutions can then become the norm. On the question on the SDGs, I mean, we are 8 years away from 2030. And what needs to be done is that if you look at the sustainable development goals, the first goal was on poverty and the last goal was on partnerships. Building on what works and reducing duplication of efforts can actually ensure that in 8 years remaining, we can be able to do a lot if we build on what is already working and avoid duplications. And to do this, we must tap into the energy of young people. And that needs to happen through what I call skills retooling, where young people's skills need to be retooled. They need to learn skills in areas of clean energy, in areas of adding value to agricultural produce, because that is where the jobs are, and they can tap into a $1 trillion US. And this needs policy incentives, physical policy incentives that can then be able to create an enabling environment. And structures like cooperatives should be leveraged because they are accessible to the informal sector and young people.
I know you're working a lot with the young people. I know you're doing something with retooling the youths. I just wish we had more time, because I actually wanted you to speak a little on your chores, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Munang, for speaking with us on One Slot today.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure, and I'll be back someday.
Yep, definitely. We are hoping to have you back again. Thank you. I mean, one important thing I took away, aside from every other thing he said, was we must avoid the duplication of effort. In closing, let me reiterate that climate change is happening now, and it is the most serious threat to life on our planet, not just to Africa. The good news is that there are plenty of solutions to climate change. All are well understood, as Dr. Munang has shared extensively with us today. The only thing that is left is willful implementation across board. I must say thank you very warmly for sharing your whole, hopefully, worthwhile 1 hour with us here on One Slot. I look forward to your company next week. Bye for now.